Hello everybody and welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. We're going to start off this episode finishing up our look at ranged combat in Warlord and then get back into some reviews. Okay, to round out our explanations of ranged combat in Warlord, we're going to have a group of goblin skeeters squaring off against some skeleton archers, and for this example or demonstration I'm going to use some graphics on the screen instead of miniatures. Now what we have are 5 goblin skeeters that are going to be shooting into 3 skeleton archers, and some relevant stats about the miniatures are as follows. The goblin skeeters have a ranged attack value of 2, they have 1 ranged attack each, they have a defensive value of 7, you'll see why that matters in a second even though they're shooting, they have a range of 12/18 inches, and they have the rapid shot ability. And then for the skeleton archers, they also have a ranged attack value of 2, they also have 1 ranged attack each, they have a slightly higher defensive value with an 8, they have a slightly longer range with a 15/20. They also have rapid shot, and they have deflect 1 as a special ability. As a quick reminder about some of the stats and the mechanics, to shoot we'll be rolling a d10 per model, adding their ranged attack value to it. What we want to hit as our target number is the DV, the defensive value of the person or the model you're shooting at. For range, if you are equal to or under the number before the slash, you don't take a penalty. If you're over the first number, in the case of the goblins, if they're more than 12 inches away but less than 18, they can still shoot, but they're -1 on their shots. Rapid shot gives you an extra shot, but all of your shots are going to be a -1 when you're using rapid shot. The skeleton's deflect special ability is going to give them a bonus to their DV when they're faced with ranged combat. So they already have a DV of 8, they're going to be getting shot, so deflect 1 adds 1 to their DV, gives them a DV of 9 against ranged combat. Okay, so we're ready to shoot, and what we're going to say is, for this example, the goblins have the activation, so they're going to be declaring shots, and what we're going to do is declare that all the goblins are going to shoot into all of the skeletons. We would already have checked to make sure that everybody has a line of sight and we're within range. We're going to say that for this combat, all of the models are within 13, 14, 15 inches, so they're all going to be within short range of the skeletons. That's going to matter in a minute, and they're all going to be within the long range of the goblin skeeters. So with some quick calculations, we see that the target number for the goblin skeeters is going to start off at an 8 because that's the DV of the skeleton archers. It's going to be 9 because of their deflect value. It goes up to 10 because we're at long range, and since we want to get a lot of shots off, we're going to use rapid fire, so we'll get twice as many shots, but ultimately our target number is going to be an 11. And then after rolling 10 dice to hit, because we're getting twice as many attacks, we end up with a 2, a 2, a 4, a 4, another 4, 2 6s, an 8, a 9, and a 10. When we add the 2 RAV of the skeleton archers to it, we find that on the high rolls, our 10 becomes a 12, and 9 becomes an 11, the 8 becomes a 10. The rest we know are going to be misses or non-damaging hits just because they're so low. The 8 that turns into a 10 isn't the 11 that we needed, so that's discarded. The 9 that becomes an 11 is going to be a damaging hit. The 10 that becomes a 12 is a damaging hit regardless of whether we added 2 to it or not, because a 10 always is going to hit and cause damage. So our net result right now is going to be 2 damaging hits on the skeletons. We would mark off 2 damage tracks, 1 from each of 2 skeletons. They only have 1 damage track each. Normally we would remove them, but they get a chance to shoot back with defensive missile fire. Since the skeleton archers have a ranged weapon, they're archers, and they're not in base-to-base contact with enemy models, they now get to shoot back using defensive missile fire. And they're also going to use rapid shot, so their target number that they're looking at is going to be increased by 1 because of that. They're still within their short range because we said everything was under or at 15 inches, so they're good there. So normally their target number is going to be a 7 because of the DV of the goblin skeeters. It's going to go to 8 just because we're using rapid shot, so it's going to be 1 harder to hit them, but that is all they're looking at right now, is needing 8s to hit. And after rolling their 6 dice, we get 2 2s, a 6, 2 7s, and an 8. The 2s we can throw away. The 6 becomes an 8, the 7s become 9s, and the 8 becomes a 10. So on the return fire, we have 4 damaging hits going into the goblin skeeters. Now, once you're done establishing all of your hits and misses and damaging hits and everything, that's when damage takes effect. So what we'll do is we would pull off 2 of the skeleton archers and 4 of the goblin skeeters. So when you're using ranged combat in Warlord, you really have to be, or try to be, aware of the ranges you're at, if your opponent is going to get defensive missile fire, if maybe they are better missile troops than your guys that are shooting into them. Bear those things in mind. Think about what kind of negatives you're going to be at when you're shooting. Is it really worth taking the shot at these guys, or should you be shooting or moving and shooting at somebody else? Okay, back to reviews now, and all of these next ones are Warlord miniatures, which is fitting since we just talked about Warlord. And the first one contains a little bit of nudity, so avert your eyes if you need to. This is a new miniature for a new faction that's coming out for Warlord. It's called the Icingstead faction, and it's going to contain things like Yetis and Barbarians and Frost Giants and things like that. And this is a Handmaiden of Keskura. It's a single-piece model. She's wearing very little in the way of clothing, so off in the snowy, mountainous regions of the Icingstead, she'll be a little bit chilly. She has big furry boots on, along with a loincloth that has a couple pouches on it. You can see she's carrying a couple daggers, and she's in a pose where she looks like she's striking down at an opponent or something. There's an extra tab of metal that goes from the bottom of her right boot down to the casting tab that you'll need to clip off. Cleaning was limited to a few tiny bits of flash here and there on the model, and a couple of mold lines, one going up the back of her left leg and one on her right thigh that needed to be cleaned, but it really wasn't too much. Clipping off the extra tab of metal probably took longer than cleaning up the mold lines that were there. I could see using her in my alternate Revan army, where I use cavemen and cavewomen and other kind of jungle savages and dinosaurs in place of orcs and goblins. She could fit in with the other cavemen in that army if you're not looking at an Icingstead army. To me, I think the Frost Giants and Yetis and everything sounds kind of cool, so I might look into that too. Next is a miniature for the Razig faction, and if you remember, these are undead pirates, so we have skeletons and zombies and things like that. This is a single-piece miniature called Crow's Nest Willie, and you can see he's carrying a large rifle with a scope on it. He's standing on a box, taking aim downfield with the eyes that aren't in his skull, and he needed a little bit of cleaning. There were mold lines along most of the perimeter of the model. The most difficult one to deal with was on the scope of the rifle. It was recessed a little bit, so it was a little bit more difficult to get to than just a mold line that was on a flat edge. Willie is dressed as you'd expect a pirate to be dressed, and he also just happens to be a skeleton, so he fits in with the Razig faction perfectly. And I think he and the rest of the Razig faction would work well as a good staple group of enemies for a D&D game or other fantasy game where you might have a little bit of steampunk influence into it, where you have firearms. I think they'd work really well in that application too. These next 2 miniatures are also from an upcoming faction for Warlord. It's called the Tembrithel Woodspike Elves. So if you're thinking Wood Elves, that's what I'm thinking. And this first guy is a Sentinel. It's a 2-piece model. He's carrying a spear in one hand, and there's a shield that comes as a separate piece that needs to be glued onto his left hand. It glues right on at a little peg, so really no way to screw that up. He cleaned up quickly and easily. He's just in a little bit of a static pose, but I could see this model or a whole bunch of these models being used in a rank and file game like Warhammer Fantasy Battle as a whole block of Wood Elf Spearmen. They'd be really good in that. And then to round things out for this episode, we have a much more dynamically posed Wood Elf, and this is an Oak Hearth Warden. Single-piece model, where he also has a shield in his left hand, but he has a sword in his right hand, and he's posed to look like he's about to strike down upon an enemy. He's wearing what looks like to be a combination of studded leather and scale armor. There's a dagger on his belt. You can see he's got a long flowing cape on with a hood. Underneath the hood, his face looks like he's yelling or screaming at whoever he's about to put the chop on. There were some visible mold lines on the model, but I think he would be very well suited to being a player character model in D&D, Pathfinder, whatever, Warhammer Fantasy roleplay if you want. He would also be a good leader of a unit of Wood Elves in any kind of tabletop game. Really top-notch model here. Okay, everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. We'll see you next time.